She was the first wife of Adam, the one who refused to submit to him, the one who looked at him equal to equal and said no. And for that they erased her. They buried her name in forbidden texts, wrapped her story in fear, called her a demon, a seductress, a monster born of darkness. For thousands of years, entire civilizations taught their children to be afraid of her. Mothers whispered her name like a curse. Priests condemned her from pulpits. Scholars locked her story behind walls of silence. But here is what they never told you. Lilith was not born evil. She was made into a monster by people who were terrified of what she represented. And the truth, the real truth, is far more powerful, far more human, and far more devastating than any demon story ever written. What you are about to hear is not the story they told you in Sunday school. This is not the sanitized, comfortable version. This is the version they hid, the one buried in ancient Mesopotamian clay tablets, whispered about in Kabbalistic texts, hidden in the margins of manuscripts that most people were never meant to read. By the time this is over, you will not see Lilith the same way again. You may not see the story of creation the same way again either. Stay with this, because this is where the truth begins. Before there was Eve, before there was the garden as most know it, ancient traditions speak of a first woman, not crafted from a rib, not fashioned as a companion or a helper, created, according to these texts, the exact same way Adam was, from the dust of the earth, from the same raw material, at the same moment, with the same divine breath filling her lungs. She rose from the ground just as he did. She opened her eyes to the same sky, the same light, the same world bursting into existence around her. And she believed she was equal, because everything about her creation told her she was. Now pause here, because this is where the story takes its first dark turn, and most people never realize what actually happened. Adam did not see equality. What he saw was a woman who refused to lie beneath him, who refused to take the lower position in the most intimate act of their existence together. This may sound like a small thing, a domestic dispute in paradise, but understand what this moment actually was. This was the first assertion of will in human history. The first time a created being looked at another created being and said, "We are the same, you do not rule me. I will not yield simply because you demand it." And Adam's response was not to negotiate, it was not to reflect, it was to appeal to a higher power and demand that she be brought back and forced to submit. Lilith refused, and she left. She spoke a name, the secret, ineffable name of God, and she rose, she flew. She vanished from the garden into the wild, untamed world beyond its edges. And that act of departure, that single moment of choosing her own freedom over an imposed hierarchy, is what condemned her in the eyes of every tradition that came after. Not violence, not evil, not darkness. She left. She chose herself, and for that they turned her into a demon. But here is what those same traditions could not erase, no matter how hard they tried. The earliest records of Lilith do not come from Hebrew scripture alone. They come from ancient Sumeria, from Mesopotamia, from a time before the Bible was written, when human beings were first scratching their fears and their myths into wet clay. In these ancient texts, she appears as Lilith, a storm spirit, a wind demon, a creature of the in-between spaces. She lives in wild places. She haunts the edges of civilization. She is dangerous, yes, but she is dangerous in the way that freedom is dangerous, in the way that the desert is dangerous, not malicious, not evil, simply untamed. And untamed things have always frightened those who need control. The more you look at what was actually said about Lilith across different cultures and different centuries, the more a pattern emerges, and it is a pattern that should unsettle you. Every civilization that encountered her story added more darkness to it, more horror, more teeth, as if each generation needed her to be worse than the last. As if something about her original story was so threatening that it had to be buried under layer after layer of demonization until the real woman, the real figure, was completely unrecognizable. In the alphabet of Ben Sira, written somewhere between the 7th and 11th centuries, Lilith appears in her most infamous form. She has sent 3 angels, Senoi, Sansonoi, and Semengoloth, who are dispatched to bring her back to Adam. She refuses, and she makes a terrifying declaration. She will prey upon newborn children. She will haunt the nights of sleeping men. She will bring death and sickness wherever she goes. This is the Lilith most people know. This is the demon. But stop, read that story again and ask yourself, who wrote it, when did they write it, and what did they need her to represent? Because here is what the text does not tell you directly. It tells you that 3 angels were sent to force her to return to a man she had left. It tells you that when she refused, she was cursed and condemned. And it frames her as the monster in this story. But think about what she actually did. She exercised her will. She was threatened with force. She refused again. And when she was cornered, when the weight of divine authority was brought against her to drag her back to a life of submission, she became something that could not be controlled, something that could not be caged. Is that evil or is that survival? Few people know this part of her story. Few people know that across the ancient Near East, amulets were worn not just to ward off demons, but specifically to ward off Lilith, and that the very existence of those amulets tells us something extraordinary. They tell us that ordinary people, across thousands of years and dozens of cultures, believed she was real, believed she had power, believed she walked the edges of the world they lived in. That kind of belief does not arise from nothing. That kind of fear does not emerge from pure invention. What were they actually afraid of? In ancient Mesopotamia, the terror of Lilith was deeply connected to the vulnerability of new life, newborn children, women in childbirth, the fragile first days of existence. She was invoked as a threat to everything that was most precious and most precarious. And in a world without medicine, without sanitation, without any way to explain why a healthy child suddenly stopped breathing in the night, a figure like Lilith gave shape to the shapeless terror of loss. She became the explanation for grief that had no explanation. This is what demons actually are, not evil beings who chose darkness. They are the names human beings give to the things they cannot understand, the losses they cannot explain, the fears they cannot face directly. Lilith was not the cause of infant death in the ancient world. She was the story they told to survive it. But something else was happening at the same time. Something that runs beneath the surface of every text that mentions her, that flickers in the margins of every condemnation, every warning, every amulet inscription. Lilith was also power. She was not described only as a destroyer. She was described as beautiful, seductive, magnetic. She was the force that pulled men away from their wives in the night, that visited them in their dreams, that drew them toward something they could not name. And the fact that she was both feared and desired, feared precisely because she was desired, tells you something essential about why her story survived at all. She represented something that civilization, as it organized and structured itself, needed to suppress. The wild, the feminine that would not be contained, the desire that refused to be legislated, the freedom that made authority nervous. Every society that built walls, literal walls, social walls, walls of law and doctrine and scripture, needed a figure on the outside of those walls, a figure who represented what happened when the rules were refused, when hierarchy was rejected. When the woman said no. She was that figure, she was the warning, and in being made into a warning, she became something far more powerful than any demon. Now this is the part of the story that cuts deepest. This is where her tragedy becomes undeniable. Lilith did not choose to be a monster. She was constructed as one, piece by piece, text by text, century by century. The people who needed her to be dangerous added to the architecture of her darkness. A wing here, a serpent's tail there, the killing of children, the seduction of holy men, the command of lesser demons, the title Queen of Hell. Each addition served a purpose. Each layer of horror was placed there by someone who needed to explain something, control something, frighten someone into compliance. And beneath all of it, beneath every wing and every talon and every whispered curse, was a woman who had stood in a garden at the beginning of time and said, simply, I am equal. I will not be made lesser. Imagine that for a moment. Imagine being the being who first spoke those words, in that place, at that moment, and having the entire weight of human history fall upon you for it. Imagine becoming, across 3,000 years of storytelling, the name that mothers used to frighten their daughters into obedience, the figure that priests invoked to explain why female pride was dangerous, the demon whose story was told, again and again, to make sure that no other woman ever got the idea that she could simply leave. Because that is what Lilith's story was actually for. That is the function it served. Not to explain evil, not to describe some cosmic being of darkness who threatened the order of heaven. It was a story told to keep women afraid of what happened to the woman who refused. And it worked. For a very long time, it worked. But there is another current running through her story. A secret undercurrent that the demonizers could not quite kill, no matter how hard they tried. And it runs through the mystical tradition, through Kabbalah, through the hidden literature of Jewish mysticism, through the texts that were passed from teacher to student in whispers, never meant for general circulation. In these traditions, Lilith is not simply a demon, she is something far more complex. She is the dark feminine, the shadow side of the divine. She exists in a kind of terrible symmetry with Shekinah, the divine feminine presence, the immanent face of God. Where Shekinah is light, nurturing, present in the home and the family and the Sabbath candles, Lilith is the other face, the face that exists in the wilderness, in the unmarked places, in the spaces where God is felt not as comfort but as vertigo, as awe, as terror. The mystics knew something that the simple demonologists did not. They knew that darkness is not the same as evil, that the shadow is not the enemy of the light, it is its necessary companion, that a world with only brightness is as blind as a world with only darkness. And so in their understanding, Lilith could not be simply eliminated. She could not be wished away or exorcised out of existence. She was part of the structure of reality itself. This is a staggering idea, and few people have ever been allowed to hear it. Because if Lilith is not evil, if she is simply the dark side of a sacred feminine that exists in genuine balance with the light, then the entire story told about her collapses. The demon disappears, and what remains is something far more challenging, far more interesting, far more difficult to dismiss. What remains is a woman who was the first to say no, and a universe that could not simply erase her for it. Her influence moved across cultures like water moving under stone, invisible, patient, unstoppable. In ancient Mesopotamia, she was Lilith. In Sumerian myth, she appears in the shadows of the story of Inanna, in the dark tree where she dwells before being driven out. The ancient Persians knew a figure like her. The early Arab world had their own version, their own name for the female demon of the night winds. She crossed borders that empires could not cross. She outlasted kings. She survived every attempt to bury her. Why? What is it about this story, about this particular figure, that human civilization could not let go of, even as it condemned her? The answer, when you finally see it, is almost too simple. She is the part of the human story that refuses to die. She is the question that every ordered system has to answer. What do you do with the one who will not comply? What do you do with the person who looks at the structure you've built, the rules, the hierarchy, the roles assigned at birth, and says no, not from hatred, not from destruction, but from a pure, absolute refusal to be made smaller than they are? Every civilization has had to wrestle with that question, and most of them, for most of history, answered it the same way. They made a demon out of her. They told her story as a warning. They attached claws to her and called her a night monster and told their children that this is what happens when a woman refuses her place. But the story survived. Lilith survived, not as a demon, not really, but as a question, as an unanswerable challenge embedded in the very foundation of the world's oldest stories. And now, at this particular moment in history, more people than ever are asking that question. More people than ever are going back to the original texts, reading the margins, following the threads that lead behind the official story to something older, stranger, and far more true. What they are finding, there is not a monster. What they are finding is a woman who stood at the beginning of the world and refused to kneel. A woman who was punished for that refusal in every way a story can punish someone: exile, demonization, blame for every misfortune, every dark night, every unexplained grief. A woman who was turned, slowly and deliberately, into the face of everything that needed to be feared. And yet she endured. This is the part that demands you sit with it. This is the part that matters more than any particular detail of any particular myth. She endured because the truth she represented could not be destroyed. Because the question she embodied, "Are we equal?" is a question that does not go away simply because the people in power wish it would. Because you can bury a story under 1,000 years of condemnation, you can surround it with warning and curse and supernatural horror, and it will still be there when the weight is finally lifted. Still breathing, still waiting, still asking. Throughout the ancient world, the feminine divine was not a single note. It was a chord complex, sometimes dissonant, containing both the nurturing and the terrible, both the warmth of creation and the cold authority of endings. The ancient Egyptians understood this in Sekhmet, the lioness goddess of destruction and healing, in the same breath. The Sumerians understood it in Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld, who grieved and raged and ruled in equal measure. The Hindus understood it in Kali, whose necklace of skulls does not make her the enemy of life, but its fiercest protector. Lilith belongs to this lineage. She is not the corruption of the feminine divine. She is one of its oldest and most essential expressions, the face that says the world is not only gentle, that creation contains within it the power to refuse, to resist, to endure. In the centuries that followed her first appearances in text, as Judaism moved through exile and diaspora, as Christianity spread across the ancient world, as Islam rose and reshaped the map of civilization, Lilith traveled with all of it. She appeared in medieval Jewish folklore as the demon queen who led 90,000 devils. She appeared in Christian demonology as the consort of Satan, the mother of monsters. She appeared, unnamed but unmistakably present, in the edges of folk belief across Europe, in the night hag traditions, in the stories of creatures that stole breath from the sleeping. She was everywhere they had tried to banish her. Everywhere the light was not quite bright enough to see clearly, not because she was evil, but because the fear that created her was everywhere. And fear, unlike truth, does not require evidence. The cruelest thing that was done to Lilith's story is something that takes a moment to truly feel the weight of. The cruelest thing is not the demonization itself, not the wings and the claws and the association with infant death. The cruelest thing is this: she was made into the enemy of women. Think about that, a figure whose original act was to demand equality with a man, a figure who embodied, at the very beginning, the refusal to be made lesser, was transformed, through centuries of deliberate storytelling, into a being that preyed specifically on women and children, on the most vulnerable, on the people who, in the ancient world, had the least protection and the greatest need of it. She was turned from a symbol of refusal into a symbol of danger. And the message embedded in that transformation was unmistakable. This is what your refusal costs. This is what freedom becomes when it goes beyond its permitted boundaries. This is your warning. And so generations of women heard her name and felt fear. Not kinship, not recognition, fear. The very women who might have found something true and important in her story were taught to ward her off, to hang amulets against her, to speak prayers to protect themselves from the thing she had supposedly become. It is one of the most effective acts of narrative violence in the history of human storytelling, and it was so complete, so successful, that it held for nearly 3,000 years. But here, at the end of this telling, is where the reversal happens, where the story that was taken apart must be put back together in its true form. Lilith was not a demon. She was not a destroyer of children. She was not the first wife who became evil. She was the first being in the human story who exercised will, who stood before authority, divine or human, and said, "The way you have arranged this world does not account for my nature, and I will not pretend that it does." She was punished for that with the most powerful tool available to the ancient world, story. She was written into villainy. Her name was attached to grief and terror and darkness. She was given a role in the cosmic drama that made her irredeemably monstrous, so that no one would look too closely at what she had actually done, at what her original act had actually meant. But the act remains, the moment remains. In the garden, at the very beginning of the human story, there was a being who said, "I am equal, I will not be diminished." And she paid every price there was to pay for that statement, and she did not take it back. That is not evil. That is a kind of courage that most of us, across all of history, have barely been able to imagine, let alone embody. She flew into the wilderness. She endured exile. She endured 3,000 years of being called a monster by people who had never read her original story, who knew her only through the accumulation of horror that others had layered over her name. She endured being made into a warning instead of a truth. She endured all of it. And she is still here. Not in the way that demons persist, through fear, through avoidance, through the anxious hanging of protective charms. She persists the way that true things persist, the way that questions persist. Every generation that goes back to the original texts and asks, wait, what actually happened? Every scholar who reads the alphabet of Ben Sira and notices that the angels were sent to force her back. Every person who hears this story and feels, underneath the demon mythology, something else, something that resonates, something that recognizes. She persists through them, through that recognition. Because the truth that Lilith's story carries is not about ancient Mesopotamia or medieval Jewish mysticism or the specific debates of long-dead theologians. The truth it carries is permanent. It is the truth that hierarchies do not define worth, that the one who refuses the role assigned to them is not necessarily the villain, that exile is not the same as corruption, that you can be cast out, condemned, called a monster by every authority that exists, and still not be wrong. This is what they tried to bury. This is what 3,000 years of demonization could not kill. Not Lilith herself, not some supernatural entity with wings and a hatred of newborns, but the idea she carries, the question she asks, the moment she represents. In the beginning, there was a woman made from the same dust as a man. She looked at the world she had been placed in and saw that it was arranged in a way that diminished her. She said so. She was told to comply or face exile. She chose exile. And exile, it turns out, does not always look the way power intends it to look. Sometimes exile is not a punishment. Sometimes it is the only response available to someone who will not lie about what they are. Sometimes being cast out of a garden that requires your silence to function, that requires your smallness to maintain its order, is not a loss. Sometimes it is the only honest thing left to do. Lilith walked into the wilderness with her name and her refusal and nothing else. And the wilderness did not destroy her. The wilderness became her, the wild places, the edges, the spaces between civilization and the unknown where something true and uncontrollable still breathed. She was never a demon. She was never the enemy. She was the first one brave enough to leave. And perhaps that is why, after everything, after every amulet and every curse and every sermon and every story designed to make you afraid of her name, you are still here, listening, still wanting to know what really happened, still feeling, somewhere beneath the official version, that the story you were given was not the whole story. That feeling is not an accident. That feeling is Lilith doing the only thing she ever actually did. Telling the truth.